There are some dangers in life that don't look dangerous at all. They don't break into your home. They don't wear ski masks. They don't lurk in dark parking lots. Sometimes they are already sitting at your kitchen table. Sometimes they are the people you've loved your entire life. The people you raised, the people you sacrificed everything for, the people you trusted without question. And sometimes all it takes is one signature, one moment of misplaced trust, one person saying, "Don't worry, it's just paperwork." Before you know it, your home, your memories, your security, your entire future belongs to someone else. Tonight's story isn't just about greed. It isn't just about inheritance. It's about manipulation, family betrayal, and a mother who discovered far too late that the greatest threat to everything she'd worked for was living right inside her own family. Hello everyone, my name is Lucy and welcome. If you enjoy true stories that explore family secrets, deception, mystery, suspense, and the real-life situations that many older adults quietly face every day, you're in the right place. Before we begin, I'd like to ask a small favor. If you enjoy stories like this, please click the like button and consider subscribing. Every like and every subscribe helps YouTube share these stories with more people. And maybe, just maybe, one story could help someone avoid becoming the next victim. So please pour yourself a cup of coffee, settle into your favorite chair, take a deep breath, and let's begin. The House That Love Built. Chapter 1. Margaret Hale, or at least that's what we'll call her, was 72 years old. She had been widowed for almost 8 years. Time had softened the sharp edges of grief, but it had never completely erased them. Every morning she still reached toward the empty side of the bed before remembering Thomas wasn't there anymore. Some habits never really disappear. Margaret lived alone in a beautiful white farmhouse tucked away on a quiet country road known as Briarwood Lane. The house wasn't fancy. It wasn't a mansion, but to Margaret, it was priceless. Nearly 50 years earlier, she and Thomas had built that home together. Not all at once. They couldn't afford that. Every paycheck bought a little more lumber. Every weekend brought another improvement, a new porch, a bigger kitchen, fresh paint, an extra bedroom for the children. Each nail, each floorboard, each window had a memory attached to it. There was a spot near the fireplace where Thomas accidentally hammered his thumb and spent 5 straight minutes inventing words Margaret had never heard before. There was the dining room where Daniel took his first steps. The old oak tree in the backyard, where Lily built tree houses with neighborhood friends every summer. There were pencil marks hidden inside a pantry door showing the children's heights every birthday. Margaret never painted over them. Those little marks were part of the house, just like the family itself. Visitors often complimented the farmhouse. "You've got a beautiful place," Margaret would simply smile. "It's not the house that I love, it's the life we've built inside it." After Thomas passed away, many people suggested she move, downsize, buy something smaller, move into a retirement community, but Margaret always answered the same way. "This isn't just a house, it's my heart." She had no intention of leaving, not now, not ever. She imagined finishing her life exactly where it had begun, watching the seasons change from the front porch, reading books beneath the old oak tree, growing tomatoes in Thomas's garden. She believed with all her heart that she'd spend the rest of her life there. She had absolutely no idea someone else had already been making plans for her home. Chapter 2. Two very different children. Margaret had two children, Daniel and Lily. If you met them on the same day, you'd never guess they grew up under the same roof. Lily was thoughtful, quiet, patient. She became an elementary school art teacher. Children adored her. She believed almost every problem in life could be solved with kindness, or at least made easier by it. She called her mother nearly every evening, sometimes for 5 minutes, sometimes for an hour. Often they talked about nothing important at all. The weather, recipes, television, old memories. But Lily always ended every conversation exactly the same way. "I love you, Mom. I love you too, sweetheart." Daniel was different. Extremely different. Daniel had charisma, the kind of charm that filled every room. He dressed impeccably. Expensive suits, Italian shoes, luxury watches. He drove a beautiful SUV. He worked in real estate, and everyone seemed impressed by him. He always had a confident answer, always knew someone important, always appeared successful. Margaret couldn't have been prouder. Whenever someone in town mentioned Daniel, they'd smile. "Your son has really done well for himself." Margaret glowed. "I know, he works very hard." What she didn't know was that appearances can be dangerously deceiving. Daniel wasn't wealthy, not anymore. Behind the polished suits, behind the luxury car, behind the expensive dinners was a financial disaster waiting to collapse. His investments had failed. Credit card balances kept climbing. Business loans had become impossible to repay. Every month, the bills grew larger. His income grew smaller. He needed money, a lot of money, and quickly. One sunny afternoon, Daniel parked his SUV outside Margaret's farmhouse. He didn't go inside immediately. Instead, he stood near the white picket fence, studying the property, the porch, the land, the barn, the mature oak trees. His eyes slowly moved from one corner of the property to the next. Most people would have seen memories. Daniel saw market value. He quietly whispered to himself, 600,000, maybe more. He wasn't looking at his childhood home anymore. He was looking at an asset, a solution, a way out of debt. And from that very moment, everything changed. Daniel began visiting much more often. At first, Margaret was thrilled. "My son finally has time for me. He stopped by work every day now, brings me groceries, replaces burnt out light bulbs, fixes squeaky cabinet doors, mows the lawn, carries heavy boxes into the garage." Margaret felt loved. She told Lily during one of their evening phone calls, "I don't know what's gotten into your brother lately, but he's been absolutely wonderful." Lily smiled. "I'm glad, Mom." But something didn't sit right. Daniel had never been this attentive before, not once in the past 15 years. People rarely change overnight, especially when money is involved. Lily couldn't explain why, but a quiet voice deep inside kept whispering, "Something isn't right." And sometimes that quiet voice is the one we should listen to the most. Part 2. The smile behind the plan. There's an old saying, the easiest way to fool someone is to make them believe you are helping them. Margaret didn't know it, but every bag of groceries, Every repaired cabinet, every freshly mowed lawn was buying something much more valuable than her gratitude. It was buying her trust. Chapter 3. A Son Reappears. For nearly 3 months, Daniel became the perfect son. Every Tuesday evening, he stopped by after work. Every Saturday morning, he arrived with coffee and pastry from Margaret's favorite bakery. Sometimes they sat on the front porch together for hours. They laughed, shared old family stories, looked through faded photo albums. Margaret couldn't remember the last time she felt so close to her son. One afternoon, Daniel noticed an old photograph sitting on the mantel. It showed Margaret and Thomas standing in front of the farmhouse shortly after it was finished. Thomas had one arm around Margaret, the other held little Daniel on his shoulders. Daniel smiled. "I remember that day. You cried because you wanted to help your father hammer nails. I think I was 4. You insisted you were old enough." Daniel chuckled. Thomas used to call to him, "My little builder." For just a moment, Daniel almost looked emotional. Almost. Then his eyes drifted, not to the picture, but to the windows behind it, the hardwood floors, the fireplace, the staircase, almost as if he were mentally walking through the house, calculating, estimating, pricing. Margaret never noticed. She simply smiled. "I miss your father every day." Daniel reached over and gently squeezed her hand. "I know, Mom." It was a beautiful moment, or so Margaret believed. Chapter 4. Questions that didn't seem important. Little by little, Daniel began asking questions, casual questions, questions that sounded harmless. "Mom, where do you keep your important papers?" "Oh, in the old roll-top desk in the study." "Do you still have Dad's life insurance paperwork?" "I think so." "What about the deed to the house?" Margaret looked puzzled. "I suppose it's in there somewhere." Daniel nodded. "You really should organize everything." Margaret laughed. "Oh, goodness. That's a job for another day." Daniel smiled. "I could help." Margaret thought nothing of it. After all, he was family. A week later, Daniel arrived, carrying several new file folders. "Thought I'd help organize your paperwork." Margaret smiled. "You are becoming quite the caretaker." He laughed. "I learned from the best." Again, she never questioned it. Chapter 5. Lily notices something. Meanwhile, Lily couldn't shake the uneasy feeling growing inside her. She couldn't explain it. Daniel had always loved nice things, always chased success, always wanted more. But now, something felt different. One Sunday afternoon, Lily drove to visit her mother. She found Daniel alone in the study. The roll-top desk was open. Stacks of papers covered the dining room table. Insurance documents, tax records, bank statements, old property surveys. Daniel looked up quickly. "Oh, hey." Lily glanced around. "What are you doing?" Daniel smiled. "Helping Mom organize." Lily frowned. "Since when?" Daniel shrugged casually. "She's getting older. I'm just making things easier." Lily wasn't convinced. Her eyes drifted toward the property deed lying near Daniel's elbow. He quickly flipped another folder over it, almost instinctively, almost as though he didn't want her to see. Something inside Lily tightened. It wasn't proof, not even close, but it felt wrong. That evening after Daniel left, Lily quietly asked, "Mom, are you okay?" Margaret looked surprised. "Of course I am." "Has Daniel been asking about your finances?" Margaret smiled. "Oh, honey, he's just trying to help." Lily hesitated. "I know. But has he asked about your house?" Margaret laughed softly. "Just curiosity. He works in real estate. You know how he is. Lily wanted to say more. Instead, she simply nodded. Sometimes love makes us ignore the little warning signs because believing the people we love is easier than imagining they could hurt us. Chapter 6. The Woman at the Door. 2 weeks later, it was raining, a slow, steady Virginia rain. Margaret had just poured herself a cup of tea when someone knocked at the front door. She wasn't expecting visitors. Standing on the porch, holding a leather portfolio, was a woman Margaret had never seen before. She appeared to be in her early 50s, professional, well-dressed, warm smile. "Mrs. Hale?" "Yes." "My name is Caroline Pierce. I'm an estate planning consultant." Margaret blinked. "I'm sorry? I think you've made a mistake." Caroline smiled politely. "No mistake. Your son Daniel asked me to stop by." Margaret frowned. "My son?" "Yes. He mentioned you wanted information about simplifying your estate." Margaret's smile disappeared. "I never told Daniel that." Caroline's expression barely changed. "Oh? Perhaps he misunderstood. It's becoming very common for adult children to help parents prepare for the future." Margaret shifted uneasily. "I don't think I'm ready for any of that." Caroline nodded sympathetically. "I understand. I only wanted to introduce myself." She reached into her portfolio and handed Margaret a business card. "If you ever have questions, I'm only a phone call away." Margaret thanked her politely, closed the door, and stood there, staring at the business card. Something about that visit left her unsettled, not frightened, just uneasy. For the first time, a tiny crack appeared in the trust she placed in Daniel. It was barely noticeable, barely enough to question, but once doubt enters a family, it rarely leaves quietly. Part 3. The Signature. Some people don't steal by force. They don't kick down doors. They don't wear masks. They simply convince you that giving them everything was your own idea, and that's exactly what Daniel intended to do. Chapter 7. Wearing Her Down. The phone calls became more frequent, sometimes twice a day, sometimes 3, always polite, always calm, always beginning the same way. "Hi, Mom, just checking on you." Margaret looked forward to hearing his voice at first, but after several weeks, the conversation slowly began changing. "Mom, have you thought any more about organizing your estate?" Margaret sighed. "Oh, Daniel, I'm fine. I know, but you're 72 now. If something happened unexpectedly, what would Lily do?" Margaret frowned. "I don't know exactly. That's why we need to make things easier." Every conversation ended the same way. "Just think about it. I'm only trying to help." A few days later, Daniel noticed several unpaid utility bills sitting on Margaret's kitchen counter. "They are paid," Margaret said quickly. "I just haven't filed them yet." Daniel picked one up. "You shouldn't have to keep track of all this." "I can. I've been doing it for years." "I know, Mom, but you don't have to anymore." Margaret smiled politely. "I appreciate your concern." Inside, something didn't feel quite right. She couldn't explain why. Chapter 8. The Consultant Returns. 2 weeks later, Caroline Pierce came back. This time, Daniel was with her. Margaret hadn't invited either one of them. They sat together around the old oak kitchen table, the same table where birthday cakes had been cut, where Christmas dinners had been shared, where Thomas once helped Daniel with his 3rd grade spelling homework. Today, the atmosphere felt strangely different. Caroline opened a leather folder. "I've prepared a few documents." Margaret looked confused. "I told you I'm not ready." Caroline smiled warmly. Oh, these aren't final. They simply give your son authority to help you if you ever become ill. Daniel leaned forward. It's really just for emergencies. Nothing changes. You stay right here. You keep living exactly like you always have. Margaret relaxed slightly. Really? Of course. Caroline nodded reassuringly. This is very common. Thousands of families do this. Daniel reached across the table. I'd never do anything to hurt you. Margaret looked into her son's eyes. The same blue eyes he had since childhood. The same eyes she looked into the day he was born. The same eyes she trusted for 50 years. She wanted to believe him more than anything. She wanted to believe him. Chapter 9. Lily's phone call. That evening, Lily called. Margaret almost mentioned the paperwork. Almost. But she stopped herself. She didn't want Lily worrying unnecessarily. Instead, they talked about gardening, the weather, a television show they both enjoyed. Then, just before hanging up, Lily paused. Mom? Yes? I've been thinking, if Daniel ever asks you to sign anything, I want you to promise me something. Margaret smiled. What? Promise you call me first. Margaret laughed softly. Oh, sweetheart, you are worrying too much. Promise me anyway. Margaret hesitated. I promise. But after hanging up, she quietly whispered to herself, I'm sure it won't come to that. Chapter 10. One signature. 3 days later, Daniel returned. Caroline came with him. They carried coffee, fresh muffins, flowers. The visit almost felt like a celebration. Daniel placed a thick folder on the kitchen table. There are just a few routine documents. Margaret frowned. I thought we weren't doing this. Daniel smiled patiently. We're not. It's only emergency planning. If something happened, I could pay your bills, talk to doctors, handle paperwork. You'd never even notice. Caroline slid a single page toward Margaret. The first signature simply confirms you've received the information. Margaret adjusted her reading glasses. The print looked tiny, complicated, legal. I don't really understand all this. Daniel gently touched her shoulder. You don't have to. I'm here. Margaret looked towards the family photographs hanging on the wall. Thomas, Daniel, Lily, Christmases, birthdays, graduations. She thought, he's my son. Why wouldn't I trust him? Her hand trembled slightly as she picked up the pen. For just a moment, she stopped. Something deep inside whispered, read it. Called Lily. Wait. But Daniel smiled. It's okay, Mom. I've got you. Margaret smiled back and signed. One page, then another, then another. She never noticed that Daniel quietly lifted the signed papers, slid them aside, and replaced them with another stack before asking for the remaining signatures. Caroline never said a word. Margaret signed where she was told. Within 15 minutes, everything was finished. Daniel gathered the paperwork, closed the folder, and hugged his mother. I'm so proud of you, Mom. Margaret smiled. I feel better already. Daniel kissed her forehead. You should. As they walked towards the front door, Caroline quietly asked, Do you think she'll ever realize? Daniel looked back through the kitchen window. Margaret was humming softly as she washed the 2 coffee cups. Still smiling, still believing she'd done the right thing, Daniel answered quietly, No, I don't think she ever will. Part 4. The letter. There is something unforgettable about the moment your entire world changes. For some people, it's a phone call. For others, it's a knock at the door. For Margaret, it arrived in a plain white envelope. The ordinary Tuesday morning, The mailbox stood exactly where it had always been, at the end of the gravel driveway, beside the old oak tree Thomas planted decades ago. Margaret walked out carrying her little wicker basket, just as she had thousands of times before. Electric bill, church newsletter, coupon flyer. Then one envelope caught her eye. It wasn't handwritten. It wasn't familiar. The return address belonged to a law office. Margaret frowned. I don't know any lawyers. She tucked it beneath the rest of the mail and carried everything back inside. The coffee had just finished brewing. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen window. Birds chirped outside. Everything felt perfectly ordinary until she opened the envelope. Chapter 11. The Letter Nobody Wants. Margaret unfolded several pages. Her eyes skimmed the first paragraph, then the second. She stopped breathing. She read it again, slowly. This letter serves as a formal notice that the property located at her farmhouse address has been listed for sale. Margaret blinked. No. She turned the page. There had to be some mistake. Current owner, Daniel Hale. Her hands began to shake. No. Her voice cracked. No, no, no. She hurried to the hallway closet, pulled out the old metal lockbox. Inside were family photographs, Thomas's military papers, insurance documents, and the original deed to the farmhouse. Or, at least, it should have been there. The folder was empty. Margaret stared at the empty space. Then she whispered, Thomas. Tears filled her eyes. This can't be happening. Chapter 12. The Phone Call. With trembling hands, Margaret dialed Daniel's number. 1 ring, 2 ring, 3. Finally he answered. Hey, Mom. His voice sounded cheerful, normal, as though nothing had happened. Margaret could barely speak. Daniel, I got a letter. Silence. My house. It's listed for sale. Another silence. Longer this time. Finally, Daniel sighed. It's not your house anymore, Mom. Margaret felt the room begin to spin. What did you say? You signed everything. You remember? No, I didn't. I signed emergency papers. No, you signed ownership documents. Margaret's voice became desperate. Daniel, I never would have signed my house away. You told me I'd stay here. Daniel's tone hardened. I changed my mind. You need assisted living. This is for the best. Margaret felt as though someone had reached inside her chest and squeezed her heart. Daniel, please. This house is all I have. It was your father's. I know. His voice was cold now, almost impatient. The market's good. We're selling. You'll be fine. Then he hung up. Margaret remained frozen. The phone slowly slipped from her hand onto the kitchen floor. The sound echoed through the empty house. For the first time since Thomas died, Margaret truly felt alone. Chapter 13. Lily Comes Home. It was nearly midnight when headlights turned into the long gravel driveway. Lily climbed out before the car had fully stopped. She didn't knock. She rushed inside. She found Margaret sitting exactly where she'd been for hours, still wearing the same sweater, still holding the lawyer's letter. She looked smaller somehow, older, as if 20 years had passed in a single afternoon. Lily knelt beside her mother. Oh, Mom. Margaret looked up slowly. Her eyes were swollen from crying. I trusted him. Those 4 words broke Lily's heart. I know. I trusted my own son. Lily wrapped both arms around her mother. Neither woman spoke for several minutes. The only sound was the ticking grandfather clock in the hallway. Finally, Lily whispered, "We're going to figure this out." Margaret shook her head. "I signed it. I don't even remember what I signed." Lily gently took the paperwork from her mother's hands. "I'm not giving up." She studied every page, every signature, every date. Something immediately caught her attention. The initials were not consistent. The fonts changed. Some pages looked newer than others. She frowned. "This doesn't make any sense." Margaret looked at her hopefully. "What do you mean?" Lily slowly turned another page, then another. Then she stopped. A notary stamp. The date looked wrong. Very wrong. Her heart began beating faster. She reached for her phone. "Mom, I think someone changed these documents." Margaret asked, "What?" "I don't know how yet, but something about this isn't right." For the first time all day, a tiny spark of hope appeared. Just a spark, but sometimes hope is all you need to keep fighting. Part 5. The investigation begins. Sometimes the truth doesn't announce itself. It doesn't burst through the front door. It doesn't arrive with flashing lights or dramatic confessions. Sometimes the truth hides inside tiny details. A date that doesn't match, a signature that looks different, a page that somehow feels newer than the others. Most people never notice, but Lily did. And once she saw it, she couldn't unsee it. Chapter 14. A second set of eyes. The next morning, Lily carefully placed every document into a large manila folder. She drove nearly an hour to the office of attorney Rebecca Lawson, a woman known throughout the county for handling estate disputes and elder financial abuse cases. Rebecca had practiced law for more than 30 years. She'd seen nearly everything: adult children taking advantage of aging parents, fraudulent powers of attorney, forged wills, undue influence, property theft. Sadly, none of it surprised her anymore. She welcomed Lily into her office. "So, tell me everything." Lily started at the beginning. Daniel's sudden visits, the paperwork, the mysterious consultant, the phone calls, the listing of the farmhouse. Rebecca listened without interrupting. When Lily finally finished, Rebecca quietly opened the folder. She spread every page across the conference table. One by one, she examined each document. No one spoke. Only the soft rustle of paper filled the room. Finally, Rebecca adjusted her glasses. "This," she said quietly, "isn't sitting right with me." Lily leaned forward. "Do you see it too?" Rebecca nodded. "Yes, I do." Chapter 15. Small details, big questions. Rebecca pointed towards the signature pages. "Look closely." Lily leaned over the table. "I don't understand." Rebecca slid 2 pages behind one another. "See Margaret's signature?" "Yes." "Notice how steady it is here?" She pointed to the first page. "Now compare it to this one." The second signature looked different. Not completely different, just slightly awkward, as though someone had slowly copied it. Rebecca continued, "Now look at the margins." Lily frowned. "They're different." "Exactly. The formatting changes halfway through." She picked up another page. "And these page numbers, they don't match the document sequence." Lily's stomach tightened. "What does all this mean?" Rebecca looked directly at her. "It means I have questions. And when lawyers have questions, we start looking for answers." Chapter 16. Following the money. Rebecca's investigator began digging. The first discovery came quickly. Daniel's finances. On the outside, he looked successful. Luxury vehicle, designer suits, country club membership, business owner. But appearances can be carefully manufactured. Behind the scenes, Daniel's financial life was unraveling. Several credit cards were nearly maxed out. 2 investment properties had gone into foreclosure. Business loans had fallen behind. Multiple creditors had begun collection proceedings. One lender had already threatened legal action. Rebecca quietly summarized it. He wasn't buying groceries because he suddenly became a better son. He needed an asset, the farmhouse. Lily closed her eyes. She had suspected something, but hearing it out loud hurt more than she expected. Chapter 17. Caroline Pierce. Next, they investigated Caroline, the so-called estate consultant. At first, everything looked professional. A polished website, business cards, a rented office. Then the cracks appeared. Her business license had expired. She wasn't licensed to provide legal advice. She wasn't an attorney. She wasn't a certified estate planner. She described herself using vague titles carefully, avoiding words that required professional licensing. Rebecca frowned. Interesting. Consumer complaints, civil lawsuits, disputes involving elderly homeowners, promises that paperwork was routine, families claiming documents hadn't been explained. Nothing alone proved wrongdoing, but together they painted an unsettling picture. Rebecca quietly closed the file. This woman has been operating in gray areas for years. Chapter 18. Margaret Remembers. Back in Briarwood Lane, Margaret sat in her favorite rocking chair. She stared at the family photographs lining the mantel. Thomas, Daniel, Lily, Christmas morning, birthday parties, fishing trips, graduations. Every photograph told the story of a family built on love. Or so she believed. Lily sat beside her. Mom, I need to ask you something. Margaret nodded. When you signed those papers, did anyone explain every page? Margaret thought for a long time. I don't remember. Did you read them? I tried, but Daniel kept saying, it's just routine. Don't worry, I've got you. Margaret covered her face with both hands. I trusted him. Lily gently held her mother's hand. You didn't do anything wrong. You trusted your son. Margaret looked toward the old staircase. I keep asking myself, how many times did I tell him this house would always be his someday? A tear slipped down her cheek. I never imagined he couldn't wait. Chapter 19. The letter that changed everything. Late one afternoon, Rebecca called. Lily, I have something. What is it? I've requested copies of the property records from the county. And there are discrepancies. Lily held her breath. The signatures appear on documents your mother says she never saw. She paused. And the recording dates don't line up with the meetings she described. Lily's pulse quickened. Is that enough? Rebecca answered carefully. It's enough to ask a judge some very serious questions. Part 6. The Confrontation. There comes a moment in every deception when the lies begin to collapse under their own weight. Not all at once, not dramatically, but slowly, piece by piece, until the person who built them can no longer remember where the truth ended and the lies began. For Daniel, that moment had finally arrived. Chapter 20. A visit to Daniel's office. Daniel's real estate office sat in a modern brick building downtown. Large glass windows, fresh flowers in the reception area, awards hanging on the wall. Everything about the office projected success, confidence, trust, exactly the image Daniel wanted people to see. Lily walked through the front door carrying a single manila folder. She wasn't there to argue. She wasn't there to yell. She was there for answers. The receptionist looked up. "Can I help you?" "I'm here to see Daniel Hale." "Do you have an appointment?" "No, it's family." A few moments later, Daniel appeared. His smile disappeared the instant he saw his sister. "Lily, we need to talk." "I don't think there's anything to discuss." "There is." He glanced around the office. Employees pretended not to listen, while clearly listening to every word. Daniel forced a smile. "My office." Chapter 21, Brother and Sister. Daniel closed the office door. Neither one sat down. Lily placed the folder on his desk. "I've spoken with an attorney." Daniel crossed his arms. "So?" "We've reviewed every document." He shrugged. "Good." "There are problems." "No, there aren't." "The signatures don't match." "Yes, they do." "The paperwork doesn't line up." "Yes, it does." "There are pages my mother never saw." Daniel's face remained expressionless. "You can't prove that." Lily stared at him. For a long moment, she searched his face, hoping, praying to see some trace of guilt, some hint of the brother she once knew. Instead, she found nothing, just cold calculation. She whispered, "How did you become this person?" Daniel answered quietly, "I became realistic." Chapter 22. Caroline gets nervous. Across town, Caroline Pierce sat alone in her office. Her phone rang. It was Daniel. "They've hired a lawyer." Caroline closed her eyes. "I was afraid of that." "They're asking questions." "What kind of questions?" "The paperwork." Caroline became very quiet. Finally, she spoke. "Did your mother ever read the documents?" Daniel hesitated. "Not really." Caroline slowly rubbed her forehead. "I told you this could become a problem." "You said it was fine." "I said she needed to understand what she was signing." Daniel snapped. "She signed it," Caroline answered softly. "That's not always enough." For the first time, Daniel sounded uncertain. "What if they find something?" Caroline didn't answer immediately. Instead, she quietly asked, "Did you change anything after she signed?" Silence. Long, uncomfortable silence. Caroline closed her eyes. "Oh, Daniel, what did you do?" Chapter 24, Margaret's Memories. Meanwhile, Margaret wandered slowly through her farmhouse. She touched the kitchen doorway where the children's heights were marked in pencil. Daniel, age 6, Lily, age 4, Christmas, 1989. She smiled through tears. She walked into the living room, ran her hand across Thomas's old recliner. It still sat exactly where he'd left it. His reading glasses still rested on the small table beside it. She never had the heart to move them. Upstairs, she opened the bedroom closet. Thomas's old fishing hat still hung on the hook. His flannel jacket, his favorite work gloves. She whispered, "I'm trying, Tommy. I'm trying to save our home." Then, for the first time since receiving the letter, she cried openly. Not because of the house, but because she realized the little boy she had once tucked into bed had somehow become a man she no longer recognized. Chapter 25, Rebecca's Discovery. The following afternoon, attorney Rebecca Lawson received another packet of county records. She spread everything across her desk, One document immediately caught her attention. It wasn't the deed, it wasn't the transfer, it was something much smaller, a notarized acknowledgement. The signature date placed Margaret in Daniel's office, except Rebecca already had proof. Margaret had been admitted to the emergency room that same afternoon after a severe bout of vertigo. Rebecca leaned back slowly. She looked again, then again. She reached for the phone. Lily, I think we just found our first major break. What is it? Rebecca smiled for the very first time since taking the case. If these records are correct, your mother couldn't possibly have been where these papers say she was. Lily's heart nearly stopped. What does that mean? Rebecca answered quietly. It means someone isn't telling the truth. Part 7. The Court of Truth. There is an old saying, every lie has an expiration date. Sometimes it takes days, sometimes years, but eventually the truth begins knocking, and no amount of locked doors can keep it outside forever. For Daniel, that day had finally arrived. Chapter 26. The Lawsuit. Rebecca Lawson carefully placed a finalized complaint inside a large envelope. On the first page were words Lily never imagined she'd see beside her own family's name. Petition to set aside property transfer, undue influence, fraud, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Rebecca looked at Lily. Once I file this, everything changes. Lily nodded. I'm ready. Rebecca looked towards Margaret. What about you? Margaret hesitated. For 72 years, she had avoided conflict. She believed problems could be solved with kindness, patience, and forgiveness. But this wasn't about pride. This wasn't even about money. It was about the only home she'd ever known. The home she and Thomas built together, one paycheck at a time. She took a deep breath. I'm ready. Rebecca smiled gently. Then let's fight. Chapter 27. Served. Daniel was finishing lunch with a client when someone approached his table. Daniel Hale? He looked up. Yes? You've been served. The server handed him a thick packet, then quietly walked away. Daniel stared at the envelope. His confidence faded. He opened the first page. His face turned pale. Across the top, bold black letters read, Summons. People at nearby tables continued eating, completely unaware that Daniel's carefully constructed world had just begun to crumble. Chapter 28. Caroline's Choice. Miles away, Caroline Pierce sat alone in her office. The phone rang. It was Rebecca Lawson. Ms. Pierce? I'm calling to request your cooperation. Caroline remained silent. You understand why I'm calling? I suppose I do. There are serious questions regarding documents prepared during meetings with Margaret Hale. Caroline closed her eyes. I'll have my attorney contact you, Rebecca answered calmly. That's your right. Before hanging up, she added one sentence. If you were misled by Daniel, now would be the time to say so. The line went silent. Caroline slowly lowered the phone. For the first time, she realized Daniel wasn't just protecting himself anymore. He might be preparing to let everyone else take the blame. Chapter 29. The Neighbor. News travels quickly in small towns. Within days, people on Briarwood Lane had heard whispers. One afternoon, Margaret's longtime neighbor, Eleanor, knocked gently on the front door. She carried a homemade peach cobbler. I figured you probably hadn't been eaten. Margaret smiled weakly. You know me too well. The two women sat at the kitchen table. After a long silence, Eleanor reached across the table. You know, Thomas once told my husband something. Margaret looked up. What? He said, if anything ever happens to me, promise you'll remind Margaret that this house was built with love. not money. Margaret could no longer hold back the tears. She covered her face. Eleanor simply sat beside her. Sometimes the greatest comfort comes from someone who doesn't try to fix anything. They simply stay. Chapter 30. Daniel sleeps poorly. Meanwhile, Daniel wasn't sleeping. Every night he replayed the same conversation. Rebecca, the lawsuit, the signatures, the investigation. He began checking the locks twice before bed, looking over his shoulder, jumping whenever his phone buzzed. His expensive home, once a symbol of success, now felt strangely empty. He wandered into his office, opened a locked desk drawer. Inside lay copies of the paperwork. He stared at them for a long time. His hands trembled, not from guilt, from fear. Fear that someone, somewhere, would notice something he had overlooked. Chapter 31. A Forgotten Witness. Rebecca's investigator returned to Briarwood Lane, not to question Margaret, but to speak with people who had been nearby. The mail carrier, the landscaper, neighbors. Then someone mentioned a retired handyman named Earl Jenkins. Earl had done maintenance around the farmhouse for years. Rebecca met him at a small diner. He stirred his coffee thoughtfully. "I remember that day." "What day?" "The day Daniel came over with that woman." Rebecca leaned forward. "What about it?" "I was replacing the porch railing. I wasn't trying to listen, but I heard enough." "What did you hear?" Earl looked out the window. "I remember Mrs. Hale saying, 'I don't understand these papers.' And I remember Daniel telling her, 'Mom, just trust me.'" Rebecca's expression remained calm, but inside she knew that simple statement could become one of the most important pieces of testimony in the entire case. Chapter 32. Margaret finds her voice. That evening, Margaret walked slowly through the farmhouse one more time. She stopped in front of the old hallway mirror. For weeks, she had seen only someone frightened, someone betrayed, someone broken. Tonight, she saw something else. A survivor. She looked into her own reflection and quietly said, "No one takes my voice away. Not anymore." She picked up the phone, called Rebecca. "I'm ready to testify." Rebecca smiled. "I'll see you in court." Part 8. The Day of Reckoning. There are moments in life when the truth no longer belongs behind closed doors, when whispers become testimony, when memories become evidence, and when a mother must look into the eyes of the child she once loved without question and tell the world what happened. For Margaret, that day had arrived. Chapter 33. The Courthouse. The old county courthouse stood proudly in the center of town. Its stone steps had carried generations of people seeking justice. Some arrived hopeful, some terrified, some left relieved, others forever changed. Margaret slowly climbed each step. Lily gently held her arm. "You don't have to rush," Margaret smiled faintly. "I'm not afraid of the stairs." She looked toward the courthouse doors. "I'm afraid of what's inside." Inside, everything felt strangely quiet. The polished wooden benches, the flags, the judge's bench, the witness stand. Everything looked exactly like the movies, yet somehow far more intimidating. Across the courtroom, Daniel sat beside his attorney. He never looked towards his mother, not once. Chapter 34. Under Oath. Margaret slowly approached the witness stand. The courtroom clerk handed her the Bible. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" "I do." Her voice was barely above a whisper. Rebecca Lawson stood. "Mrs. Hale, can you tell the court why you're here today?" Margaret looked around the room, then quietly answered, "I'm here because I trusted my son." Silence filled the courtroom. Rebecca waited. "What did you believe you were signing?" "I believed I was signing papers that would allow Daniel to help me if I became sick." "Did you believe you were giving away your home?" Margaret immediately shook her head. No, never. If I'd known that, I would have walked away. Rebecca nodded gently. Did anyone explain every page to you? No. Were you encouraged to read every page? Margaret looked toward Daniel, then back to Rebecca. No. What were you told? Margaret closed her eyes. She could still hear Daniel's voice. Mom, just trust me. Chapter 35, Daniel takes the stand. Hours later, Daniel was sworn in. He looked polished, confident, professional, exactly as he always had. His attorney began with simple questions. You were trying to help your mother? Yes. You believe these documents protected her? Yes. Rebecca stood. Mr. Hale, I have just a few questions. Daniel nodded confidently. Rebecca placed 2 documents on the evidence screen. Would you read the dates out loud? Daniel did. Rebecca smiled politely. Now, can you explain how your mother signed these papers in your office? On the same afternoon, hospital records show she was receiving treatment in the emergency department? Daniel froze. For just a moment, barely noticeable, but everyone saw it. He glanced towards his attorney. I don't remember. Rebecca calmly placed another document on the screen. This is your mother's emergency room intake record. She displayed another. And this is the notarized acknowledgement. She looked directly at Daniel. Would you like to explain the discrepancy? The courtroom became so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. Daniel swallowed. There must be some mistake. Chapter 36, Caroline Speaks. Caroline Pierce was called next. She looked nothing like the confident consultant Margaret remembered. Her shoulders slumped, her voice trembled. Rebecca asked only one question. Ms. Pierce, did Margaret Hale ever tell you she wanted to transfer ownership of her home? Caroline looked towards Margaret, then toward Daniel. Finally, she lowered her eyes. No. The courtroom stirred. Rebecca continued. Did she ever tell you she understood she was giving away ownership? Caroline whispered. No. Daniel closed his eyes. Rebecca asked one final question. Were all of the documents present at the time Margaret signed them? Caroline hesitated. The silence stretched. Finally, she answered, I can't say for certain. That answer said more than any speech ever could. Chapter 37, Margaret's Last Words. Before closing arguments, the judge allowed Margaret one final statement. She slowly stood. She wasn't looking at the judge. She wasn't looking at the attorneys. She looked only at Daniel, her son, the little boy she once carried on her hip, the teenager she cheered for at football games, the young man whose wedding she helped pay for. She spoke softly. When you were little, you were afraid of thunderstorms. You used to run into our room. Your father would tell you, as long as we're together, you'll always be safe. A tear rolled down her cheek. I spent my whole life trying to keep that promise. She paused. I never imagined I'd, for one day, need protection from you. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the courtroom reporter stopped typing for just a second. Daniel stared at the table, unable or unwilling to meet his mother's eyes. Part 9, the final chapter. Home is more than 4 walls. Justice is a funny thing. Sometimes it arrives with flashing lights, sometimes with a judge's gavel, and sometimes justice doesn't feel like winning at all. Because even when the truth finally comes to light, there are some things that can never be put back the way they were. For Margaret, today wasn't about getting a house back. It was about reclaiming something far more valuable. her dignity. Chapter 38. The judge speaks. The courtroom was silent. Even the old ceiling fan seemed to slow. Judge Eleanor Whitmore adjusted her glasses and looked down at the thick stack of evidence before her. She had listened for days, read hundreds of pages, studied every signature, every timeline, every witness. Finally, she spoke. The court finds that serious questions exist regarding the execution of these documents. She paused. The evidence demonstrates that Margaret Hale did not fully understand the legal effect of the paperwork presented to her. Another pause. The court further finds credible evidence that undue influence occurred. Margaret squeezed Lily's hand. Her heart pounded. The judge continued. Accordingly, the property transfer is declared invalid. A collective breath swept through the courtroom. The deed shall be set aside. The property shall be restored to Margaret Hale. Margaret closed her eyes. She didn't smile. She simply whispered, "Thank you." Chapter 39. A son's silence. Daniel never argued, never protested, never looked towards his mother. He quietly gathered his briefcase. His attorney touched his arm. Daniel simply shook his head. He understood. The courtroom emptied around him. For the first time in his life, there was no deal to negotiate, no sales pitch, no clever explanation, only silence. As he walked towards the exit, he glanced back. Margaret wasn't looking at him. She was holding Lily's hand. That hurt more than any courtroom loss. Chapter 40. Briarwood Lane. A week later, Margaret unlocked the farmhouse door. The familiar creak greeted her. The smell of old pine floors, fresh coffee, lavender, everything looked exactly the same, yet somehow nothing felt the same. She slowly walked from room to room, running her fingertips across the walls, the kitchen, the dining room, the little hallway where years ago tiny pencil marks measured Daniel and Lily growing taller every birthday. She stopped in front of Thomas's photograph, smiled softly. "We did it. I kept our promise." Then she laughed quietly. "You would have told me not to worry so much." She could almost hear his voice. "Maggie, home isn't the wood. It's the people who fill it with love." Chapter 41. Lily. That evening, Lily joined her mother on the front porch. The sun slowly disappeared behind the old oak trees. Crickets began singing. For a long time, neither woman spoke. Finally, Margaret asked, "Do you think he'll ever understand?" Lily looked across the fields. "I don't know. I hope so." Margaret nodded. "I still love him." Lily wasn't surprised. "I know. But love," Margaret whispered, "is not the same as trust." Lily smiled sadly. "No, it isn't." Chapter 42. One last letter. Several months later, Margaret found another envelope in her mailbox. This time, it was handwritten. There was no return address. Inside was a single page. "Mom, I'm sorry. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even know if I deserve it. I convinced myself I was helping. Then I convinced myself I deserved what wasn't mine. Somewhere along the way, I stopped being your son. I became someone I don't recognize. I hope one day you'll remember me before all of this happened. Love, Daniel." Margaret folded the letter. She didn't throw it away. She didn't answer it. She simply placed it inside Thomas's old Bible. Some wounds don't heal overnight. Some conversations need years. Chapter 43. The Porch Light. Every evening, just before sunset, Margaret still walked to the front porch. She switched on the porch light, just as Thomas had always done. Lily once asked, "Why do you still turn it on?" Margaret smiled. "Because someone might need to find their way home." We often think financial exploitation only happens to people who are careless. But that's rarely true and happens to people who trust, people who love, people who believe family would never intentionally hurt them. If someone asks you to sign paperwork, slow down, read every page, ask questions, talk to an independent attorney, bring another trusted family member or a friend. Never let anyone rush you. And remember, your age does not make your voice any less important. Your life, your memories, your home, your choices, they still belong to you, always. Thank you for spending part of your day with me. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of someone you love, I hope you'll leave a comment below. Your stories, your experience, and your wisdom often find someone else who may be quietly going through something similar. If you enjoyed today's documentary, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Over 60 Disabled and Alone. Every like, every comment, and every subscription helps this channel reach more people who need encouragement, information, and a reminder that you're not facing life's challenges by themselves. Until next time, take care of yourself, take care of one another, God bless you, and remember, sometimes the strongest people are the ones who quietly keep the porch light on, just in case someone finds their way home.